At the engagement party of my sister, my parents toasted the child who made the family proud before over 60 guests. Then they smirked, loudly asking if I was still dating that poor generator repairman. I stayed quiet, knowing any reaction meant their victory. Seconds later, the future father-in-law of the bride stood up, staring at my boyfriend like an apparition near the service doors. That was when the shiny facade of that luxurious room finally shattered. My name is Addison Stewart. I am 31 years old, and tonight, I am the living, breathing blemish on the otherwise flawless canvas of my family. The engagement party for my older sister, Brielle, was held at a sprawling glass mansion in Westmere Heights, Virginia. It was the kind of real estate that did not just house people, it announced them. Soft amber lights reflected off the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the manicured lawns. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, unobtrusive melody in the corner, their music floating over the clinking of crystal and the hushed, measured tones of networking, every single detail, from the imported white orchids to the highly curated guest list of local politicians, media moguls, and corporate tycoons, had been meticulously engineered by my mother, Celeste. This event was not a celebration of two people falling in love. It was a strategic corporate merger, a calculated display of power, and I was the uninvited liability that threatened to ruin their perfect aesthetic. I walked into the grand ballroom with my boyfriend, Mason Vale. Mason was tall, solid, and entirely out of place in a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer silk gowns, even though he wore his simple dark suit remarkably well. The impeccably dressed hostess checked her digital tablet, gave us a tight, rehearsed smile that did not reach her eyes, and began to lead us through the maze of elegantly decorated tables. We walked past the primary VIP section, past the tables reserved for extended family members, past the minor business associates and the local socialites. She finally stopped at the absolute furthest corner of the massive room. Our designated table was positioned practically flush against the swinging double doors of the catering kitchen. The delicate scent of roasted prime rib and expensive perfume was completely overpowered by the harsh smell of industrial dish soap and the clatter of silverware being dumped into plastic bins. I was the biological sister of the bride, yet I was seated geographically closer to the hired waitstaff than to my own blood relatives. Eventually, the room quieted down as my father, Graham Stewart, took the stage. The murmurs and the clinking of champagne glasses faded into silence as he confidently adjusted the microphone. My father owned a premier crisis management and public relations firm, and he knew exactly how to work a room of wealthy investors. He spent a full 10 minutes painting Brielle as the undisputed future of the Stewart legacy. She was brilliant, he declared to the audience. She was a visionary leader in the corporate world. He recounted her recent business conquests with the immense pride of a 5-star general listing captured territories. The audience nodded in approval, but when he finally got around to acknowledging his other daughter, the shift in his tone was stark and palpable. He tacked my name onto the very end of a long sentence like a hastily written postscript on a formal letter. He thanked everyone for coming, briefly mentioning his younger daughter Addison, who had somehow managed to get the night off from her exhausting shift work to be there. Then came the highly anticipated toast. Graham raised his glass of vintage champagne high into the air. The grand room fell into a reverent hush. He spoke eloquently about the demanding trajectory of success, emphasizing the brutal sacrifices required to build a lasting family dynasty. Then, his eyes locked directly onto mine across the vast room. His smile was sharp enough to cut through solid glass. He told the captivated crowd that there are those rare individuals who truly understand the rigorous track to success. And then there are those who make easy choices just to feel comfortable with themselves. The heavy implication hung in the air like thick smoke. I could physically feel the collective gaze of several dozen elite guests pivot away from the stage and turn toward our small table hiding by the kitchen doors. Graham was not quite finished with his performance. He smoothly shifted his attention to the quiet man sitting right next to me. He let out a low, deeply patronizing chuckle that echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. He announced to the room that it was honestly so refreshing to see someone like Mason here tonight, a simple guy who clearly prefers wearing a heavy hard hat and getting his hands dirty over wearing a tailored suit in a boardroom. A few polite, incredibly awkward laughs rippled through the crowd of tycoons and socialites. It was a masterful, public execution wrapped entirely in a thin veneer of light-hearted social banter. My jaw locked shut. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape. Every single instinct inside my body screamed at me to stand up, to throw my crystal glass against the wall, to scream at the top of my lungs until the massive chandeliers shook above us. But I forced my muscles to relax. I kept my face entirely blank. I froze my expression into an unbreakable mask of polite, bored indifference. I knew their game all too well. My parents thrived on my anger. If I reacted right now, if I showed even a fraction of the hurt and rage boiling inside me, I would instantly become the unstable, ungrateful younger daughter who violently ruined her perfect sister's perfect night. They would effortlessly play the tragic victims, and I would be the undeniable villain of the story. So, I swallowed the bitter humiliation. I just breathed in and out, counting the seconds, beside me. Mason did not flinch. He did not scowl at my father. He remained unnervingly calm and steady. He simply reached out and placed his large, warm hand squarely on the back of my wooden chair. It was a quiet, steady anchor in a turbulent sea, a silent but powerful signal telling me to hold my ground and wait. The jazz band prepared to resume playing their smooth background music. Guests began to raise their expensive glasses to their lips to drink to the happy couple. But at the very center of the room, at the primary VIP table, the celebratory atmosphere abruptly fractured. Russell Hollowell, the billionaire owner of the massive hospitality empire and the man whose son was about to marry my sister, had completely frozen in place. He was a formidable, intimidating man in his early 60s, widely known for his ruthless business acumen and his unshakable, icy composure in any situation. But right now, his glass of expensive champagne hovered motionless halfway to his mouth. He was no longer paying any attention to Graham on the stage. He was staring directly past the elaborate floral centerpieces, past the elite crowd of his peers, straight at our hidden table by the kitchen. He was staring unblinkingly at Mason. The healthy color drained completely from Russell Hollowell's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He looked as though the solid marble floor had just dropped entirely out from under his feet. The polite chatter around his immediate table died down instantly as the surrounding guests noticed his sudden, terrifying paralysis. He slowly, shakily lowered his crystal glass down to the table, spilling a few drops of champagne onto the white linen tablecloth. His hands were trembling slightly. He pushed his heavy chair back with a harsh, loud scraping sound that cut violently through the lingering silence of the ballroom. Russell stood up. He did not look at my father standing on the stage. He did not look at my sister sitting nearby. He kept his wide, shocked eyes locked firmly on the man sitting quietly next to me. His voice cracked like dry wood in a quiet room as he blurted out two words: impossible. Mason Vale. The entire grand ballroom went dead silent. To understand the profound weight of the silence that had just descended upon that opulent ballroom, you have to understand the loud, relentless machinery that built the Stewart family name. Long before we were standing in a glass mansion in Virginia, my family was practically local royalty back in Belhaven. We were the proud owners of Stewart Stratagem Group, a premier communications and reputation management firm. In simpler terms, my parents were elite spin doctors. If a prominent state senator was caught funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into a personal account, or if a tech chief executive officer needed to rapidly bury an environmental hazard report, my father, Graham, was the first person they called. He traded exclusively in perception. To him, the objective truth was nothing more than a raw lump of clay, waiting to be ruthlessly molded into a much more palatable narrative. My mother, Celeste, was his flawless counterpart in this lifelong theatrical production. She was the undisputed queen of the charity gala circuit, A woman who lived every single second of her life as though a professional photographer were constantly hidden in the bushes, waiting to capture her best angle. She curated her friendships based entirely on net worth and social utility. Our childhood home in Belhaven reflected this obsession perfectly. It was less of a home and much more of a heavily guarded museum dedicated to the concept of the ultimate American success story. Walking down the grand main hallway of our house was akin to walking through a chronological gallery of my older sister. There were heavy mahogany frames displaying Brielle winning state debate championships. There were gleaming silver frames showcasing glossy magazine covers that labeled her one of the top 30 entrepreneurs under 30 years old. There were professionally lit photographs of her shaking hands with minor celebrities and signing massive corporate contracts, if you looked closely enough. Searching with intent, you might occasionally find a picture of me. Usually, I was tucked away in a dimly lit corner of a sprawling family portrait, or I was standing slightly out of focus in the background. My face partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement or a poorly cast shadow. I was never the focal point. I was the visual afterthought, the reluctant accessory required to prove that they were a complete nuclear family. The deeply painful irony of my existence was that I had once been the chosen one for the family empire. When I was a teenager, I was sharp, incredibly quick on my feet, and I could talk my way out of any corner. Graham used to look at me with genuine pride and tell his wealthy associates that I had the absolute perfect temperament for crisis management, because I never panicked under pressure. They fully expected me to take over the firm one day and expand it into a national powerhouse, but there was a fundamental flaw in their grand design. I completely despised the act of polishing a dirty truth until it looked like solid gold. I hated the spin. I hated the way my father could look a weeping widow in the eye and convince her that a corporate settlement of $50,000 was an act of profound corporate generosity rather than a calculated bribe to keep her quiet. The definitive rupture in my relationship with my parents happened when I was 19 years old. I was expected to formally declare my university major in strategic communications and pre-law. Instead, I sat my parents down at our immaculate dining room table and told them I was entering the field of emergency grid operations and disaster response. I wanted to deal with real tangible crises where fixing a problem meant physically restoring electrical power to a freezing hospital, not restoring an artificial approval rating for a corrupt politician. From that exact moment forward, I was permanently branded as the stubborn, difficult, and ungrateful child. I had rejected the perfect script they wrote for me. And in the Stewart family, going off script was an unforgivable offense. My mother never resorted to screaming matches. Her disapproval was much more refined, delivered through perfectly modulated questions that sounded like maternal concern, but felt exactly like surgical strikes. During holiday dinners, surrounded by extended family, she would tilt her head, offer a deeply sympathetic smile, and ask if I was really still working those exhausting night shifts. She would casually wonder aloud if a grueling administrative job wearing construction boots truly had a long-term roadmap for someone of my intellectual pedigree. She knew exactly how to twist the knife deep into my ribs without ever leaving a visible fingerprint or raising her voice above a polite conversational volume, and Brielle simply let it happen. My sister was not overtly cruel to me in public. She never actively joined in on the mockery or threw the first stone, but her silence was its own devastating kind of weapon. She had grown incredibly comfortable basking in the warm, lucrative glow of being the perfect golden daughter. Defending my life choices would require stepping out of her safe zone and directly into the line of fire. Brielle was far too highly trained in public relations to ever risk tarnishing her own immaculate image for my sake. She watched me get diminished year after year and simply offered a pathetic, apologetic shrug when no one else was looking. It took me a very long time to understand the true, toxic nature of my family dynamic. The most agonizing part of my upbringing was not the passive-aggressive comments, the blatant favoritism, or the constant comparisons. It was the shrinking. Every single time the family needed to present a united, flawless front to the outside world, I was systematically minimized. I was cropped out of the narrative to make room for their ambition. I learned the hardest and coldest lesson a child can possibly learn. In my family, your fundamental value as a living human being was strictly measured by your ability to serve and elevate the Stewart reputation. If you could not be put on a glossy billboard, monetized in a boardroom, or bragged about over 18 holes at the country club, you simply did not matter. The real world, the one that exists far outside the velvet ropes and champagne flutes of my family, does not care about your carefully curated public image. It only cares about what you can do when the lights go out. For the past several years, I have worked as an emergency power restoration coordinator at the Northline Grid Response Authority. We are the central nervous system for the regional infrastructure. When a severe winter storm tears down the primary transmission lines, or when a massive substation inexplicably catches fire in the middle of July, we are the people who manage the ensuing chaos. My working environment is a stark, jarring contrast to the plush, climate-controlled corner offices my parents inhabit. The dispatch center is a cavernous, windowless concrete room bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of fluorescent overhead lights. One entire wall is dominated by a towering digital map of the regional power grid, glowing with green, yellow, and red fault lines that pulse like a living, erratic heartbeat. The air constantly hums with the low, steady vibration of server racks and the chaotic symphony of ringing telephones, urgent radio chatter, and the rapid clacking of keyboards. My job is to command the deep night shifts. I sit at a massive curved console with 6 monitors, wearing a heavy headset that permanently dents my hair. I do not wear tailored silk blouses or designer blazers. My daily uniform consists of heavy steel-toed boots, durable denim, and a thick, high-visibility reflective jacket. I spend 14 solid hours fielding desperate calls from panicking hospital administrators, nursing home directors, and municipal leaders whose entire districts have plunged into sudden, terrifying darkness. My sole responsibility is to triage the disaster. I have to look at the massive board, analyze the rapid flow of incoming damage reports, and make split-second decisions about which geographical sector receives priority routing from our emergency reserves. My parents and my sister have always dismissively referred to my career as low-level administrative support work. They picture me as an overgrown receptionist answering customer service complaints about broken street lamps. They have absolutely no comprehension of what it actually means to hold the fragile, invisible thread of a functioning city in your bare hands. They do not know what it feels like to have the lives of 100 vulnerable people depending entirely on your ability to stay ruthlessly calm while alarms are blaring in your ears. I learned the true weight of my job during a catastrophic ice storm 2 winters ago. It was 3 a.m, and the temperature outside had plummeted to single digits. A massive, ancient oak tree gave way under the weight of the ice and collapsed directly onto a primary feeder line, instantly wiping out the electrical grid for the entire Western Medical District. At the exact same moment, the automated backup generators at the Regional Critical Care Center failed to properly sequence. The facility manager called my line, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. The neonatal intensive care unit and the surgical suites were running on temporary battery reserves that would completely drain in less than 45 minutes. The entire dispatch room erupted into shouting, but I locked everything out. I stared at the schematic on my screens, tracing the complex web of secondary circuits and dormant industrial substations. I bypassed the standard protocols, immediately contacting the field linemen who were freezing in their bucket trucks, and directed them to manually bridge a connection from an adjacent manufacturing zone. We routed power through a narrow, risky pathway, pushing the transformers to their absolute limit. The power hit the hospital with just 12 minutes to spare before the life support batteries died. When my 14-hour shift finally ended, I did not drive home. I slumped forward across my console, pressed my face against my cold keyboard, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep smelling of stale coffee and stale sweat. When I finally woke up 2 hours later, the veteran dispatchers, men who had worked the grid for 30 years, came over and clapped me firmly on the shoulder. It was a quiet, profound gesture of genuine respect. A month later, the Northline Grid Response Authority awarded me an internal merit plaque for crisis management. It was a heavy, unpretentious piece of engraved brass mounted on dark wood. I was not the type of person to brag, but sitting in my small apartment, looking at that physical proof of my competence, I felt a rare, vulnerable spark of pride against my better judgment. I took a picture of the plaque and sent it to our family group message. I added a short text explaining that my department had recognized my work during the big winter outage. I set my phone face down on my kitchen counter and waited. 1 hour passed, then 2 hours, then 4 hours. Finally, my phone buzzed. I opened the message. Brielle had simply tapped a digital heart reaction on the photograph. There was no text. There was no congratulations. My mother did not call. My father did not reply at all. Later that exact same evening, I opened a professional networking site and saw a massive glowing post written by my father. He had uploaded a professionally edited photograph of Brielle signing a contract. He wrote a 500-word essay boasting to his thousands of corporate followers about how his brilliant eldest daughter had just secured a multi-million-dollar communications deal. He called her a visionary. He called her the pride of the Stewart family. The comment section was instantly flooded with congratulations from wealthy executives and local politicians. My quiet, brass plaque, representing actual lives saved in the freezing dark, was effortlessly buried and forgotten beneath a landslide of corporate vanity. I sat in my quiet kitchen and stared at my phone for a very long time. I did not cry. The tears had dried up years ago. Instead, I felt a heavy, cold clarity settle into my bones. That night, I finally accepted the absolute truth about my family. They were not broken people incapable of experiencing human love. They simply chose to treat their love like a strict financial portfolio. They distributed their attention and their affection based entirely on the projected return on their social investment. I was not a profitable asset. I was a liability. A stubborn blue-collar worker who could not be paraded around a country club or used to secure a lucrative public relations contract. The agonizing ache in my chest finally began to dissolve, replaced by a hardened, quiet resolve. From that night forward, I stopped waiting for their applause. I stopped wishing for a seat at their polished mahogany dinner table. I no longer wanted their conditional, manufactured love. I only wanted to be treated as a sovereign, capable adult, rather than the permanent, embarrassing rough draft of a family that valued a fake image over a real daughter. My sister Brielle was 29 years old when she agreed to marry Grant Hollowell, to the untrained eye of a casual society observer. Their union looked like a modern fairy tale ripped straight from the pages of a luxury bridal magazine. Grant was handsome in a quiet, subdued way, and he carried the immense weight of being the sole heir to the Hollowell Hospitality Group. His family owned a sprawling empire of high-end boutique hotels and exclusive coastal resorts stretching from Florida to California. But I knew my parents, and I knew exactly how they operated. This engagement was not a tender celebration of true romance. It was a highly calculated corporate merger, a glittering debut of a strategic alliance designed to open a massive pipeline of wealth. The underlying objective of this entire lavish evening was securing a master public relations contract. My mother, Celeste, had been drilling the supreme importance of this night into everyone for 6 solid months. She viewed this party as the ultimate springboard, the decisive night that would finally elevate Stewart Stratagem from a highly successful regional firm to a dominant national player. Every single napkin fold, every floral arrangement, and every note played by the hired jazz band was meticulously orchestrated as part of an aggressive brand campaign. The Hollowell family was the prize, and my parents were determined to close the deal before the expensive wedding cake was even cut. The sheer depth of their manipulation became entirely clear to me exactly 1 week before the party. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off a borrowed power tool. Sitting unattended on the massive marble kitchen island was a stack of glossy, freshly printed internal brochures. They were customized pitch decks intended exclusively for the Hollowell Executive Board. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the heavy cover. I flipped through the expensive, thick pages detailing my father and his unparalleled crisis management strategies. Then my blood ran entirely cold. Right there on page 14, under a highlighted section titled Community Grounding and Essential Values, was my name. There was no photograph, but there was a neatly formatted, entirely fabricated paragraph detailing how the Stewart family deeply respected all levels of the American workforce. The text proudly highlighted a younger daughter who served on the gritty front lines of emergency municipal infrastructure. I had never once consented to being used as a corporate prop. I was nothing more than a convenient bullet point to them, a manufactured symbol of their fake humility. They needed to look relatable and grounded to a family of wealthy hoteliers who employed thousands of blue-collar workers, and they stole my actual life to build their lie. I was absolutely furious. But before I could confront my father, my phone buzzed in my pocket with a long message from Brielle. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive sibling management. She started by telling me she loved me, but then she immediately pivoted to begging me not to make the atmosphere awkward at the party. She wrote that there was a tremendous amount of money riding on this night for our father and for Grant. She preemptively apologized for the seating arrangements, falsely claiming the event planner made an administrative mistake, but the underlying message was crystal clear. She was silently demanding my absolute compliance. She wanted me to show up, stay hidden in the shadows, and keep my mouth completely shut, exactly like I always did. I honestly felt a tiny sliver of pity for Grant. During the few agonizing family dinners we had shared, leading up to the engagement announcement, he seemed like a genuinely polite man. However, he also possessed a noticeable, hollow lack of backbone whenever his formidable father was in the room. Grant would confidently start to express a business opinion. But the very moment Russell Hollowell cleared his throat or narrowed his icy eyes, Grant would immediately fold. He would skillfully change the subject to avoid any form of direct conflict. Grant was clearly just as trapped inside the rigid, unforgiving power structure of the Hollowell empire as Brielle was inside the Stewart public relations machine. What my parents blatantly failed to realize in their blind, greedy ambition was that Russell Hollowell was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. Through my daily professional network at the Utility Authority, I had recently heard persistent industry whispers about the hospitality group. The Hollowell empire was currently buckling under the immense financial pressure of sweeping federal safety mandates, several of their oldest, most profitable flagship hotels had recently failed critical infrastructure inspections. They were being legally forced by the state to completely overhaul their emergency backup power systems, install heavy-duty industrial generators, and modernize their entire electrical grids to meet strict new fire and safety standards if they failed to fully comply by the end of the current fiscal year. They would lose their operating insurance, which meant they would instantly default on massive commercial loans. Russell was a desperate man backed into a very expensive corner. This hidden desperation was exactly why my father was practically salivating. Graham knew through his back channels that the Hollowell Group was facing a massive, impending wave of negative press regarding these safety violations. He wanted to swoop in, secure the exclusive public relations contract, and expertly spin the mandatory safety upgrades as a proactive, visionary green energy initiative championed by Russell himself. Graham needed to convince a ruthless billionaire that the Stewart family possessed the perfect, flawless public image to fiercely protect and elevate the Hollowell legacy. In this high-stakes game of corporate seduction, I was not merely the embarrassing sister who worked manual labor in steel-toed boots. I was a direct, volatile threat to their core narrative. I was a walking, breathing contradiction to the polished, elite image my father was desperately trying to sell. If Russell Hollowell saw a single fracture in the Stewart family dynamic, if he sensed any domestic instability or lack of absolute control, he would never trust Graham with his multi-million-dollar crisis management campaign. My parents did not just want me at the back of the room because they were superficially ashamed of my career choice. They desperately needed me invisible because I was the one unpredictable variable that could instantly blow up their most lucrative payday. They had weaponized my existence for a glossy brochure, but in person, they needed me entirely erased. I first crossed paths with Mason Vale about 8 months before the engagement party. The utility authority had dispatched me to a sprawling, dusty industrial lot down in Red Clay County. It was late spring, right before the heavy hurricane season was scheduled to hit the coast, and our procurement department desperately needed to secure a dozen heavy-duty mobile generators for emergency backup. The yard was a chaotic graveyard of rusted metal and towering diesel engines. I expected to meet a slick regional sales manager eager to push a predatory rental contract on a desperate municipal agency. Instead, I met a man covered in dark engine grease, quietly rebuilding a massive alternator by hand. Mason wore faded denim jeans and a plain gray cotton shirt that had clearly seen better days. He did not offer a polished pitch or hand me a glossy business card when I introduced myself and handed him my list of required specifications. He simply wiped his hands on a shop rag, looked over the document, and began walking me through the yard. He spoke very little at first, but his technical knowledge was staggering. He did not just read the manufacturer labels. He understood the intricate physics of electrical systems, the exact threshold of peak demand failures, and the complex mechanical realities of sustained backup loads. But what truly caught my attention was not his rugged appearance or his mechanical skill. We were standing next to a massive 2,000 kilowatt unit when he suddenly stopped talking about voltage regulation and looked directly at me. He asked, "Where do you prioritize saving before the power comes back?" No one had ever asked me that question before. My family only cared about the title on my badge, and my corporate supervisors only cared about the final resolution metrics. But Mason asked about the profound, agonizing weight of the decision itself. I told him the truth. I explained the brutal triage of choosing a pediatric hospital over a dense residential neighborhood, the quiet guilt of leaving thousands of people in the freezing dark so that a dozen critical care patients could survive the night. He listened with absolute, undivided attention. We spent the next 2 hours leaning against a chain-link fence, talking about the invisible labor that keeps modern society functioning. We bonded over the shared, solitary reality of doing jobs that nobody ever applauds until the exact moment everything falls apart. Our relationship grew steadily from that dusty afternoon in Red Clay County. Mason was a calming presence, a quiet shelter from the relentless, deafening noise of my family. Yet, from the very beginning, there was a distinct, undeniable shadow of contradiction surrounding him. He lived the life of a manual laborer, spending 12 hours a day elbow-deep in engine oil and copper wiring, but there were brief, fleeting moments where a completely different version of the man slipped through the cracks. He was notoriously evasive whenever the topic of his personal history came up in conversation. When I asked him how he learned so much about municipal power grids, he simply stared out the window and quietly mentioned, "I used to work in boardrooms that did not suit me anymore." He deliberately kept his world small, but I kept noticing details that simply did not fit the narrative of a simple repairman. One Tuesday evening, we were sitting in the cramped office behind his repair bay. I was eating takeout food while he manually recalibrated a complex automatic transfer switch on his workbench. His personal phone rang, and the caller identification brightly displayed the name of a prominent corporate law firm located in the financial district. I saw him decline the call without a second thought. Later that same week, I accidentally glanced at his open computer screen and saw a highly complex email thread discussing risk compliance and international supply chain logistics. I asked him about it, and he smoothly brushed it off as a minor consulting favor for an old friend. The most glaring inconsistency happened during the middle of winter. The Regional Energy Coalition was hosting their annual charity gala downtown. It was an incredibly exclusive event, the kind of room my parents would kill to secure an invitation to. I went to the apartment of Mason to drop off some groceries and saw 2 premium tickets sitting carelessly on his kitchen counter, completely buried under a stack of unpaid utility bills. I asked him if he was planning to attend. He casually shook his head and said the tickets were just promotional junk mail. He then spent that entire Saturday night driving a rented flatbed truck through a blinding snowstorm to deliver and install a replacement generator for a rural nursing home whose primary power source had completely failed. He turned down a room full of millionaires to freeze his hands off, helping strangers for free. I began to realize that Mason was not just a humble mechanic. He was a man who was intentionally shrinking himself. He was deliberately hiding his true scale from the world. I eventually confided in him about the suffocating pressure of my family. I told him about the subtle insults, the blatant favoritism, and the agonizing feeling of being constantly erased by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I fully expected him to get angry on my behalf. I thought he would tell me to cut them off entirely or to confront them and demand their respect. Instead, Mason sat quietly, holding my hand. He looked at me with those deep, steady eyes and offered a perspective that completely shifted my understanding of my own life. He said, "People usually despise what they do not understand. The danger is when they have power." He was right, and I felt a profound sense of safety with him. But looking back on that conversation, I should have realized that Mason Vale knew far too much about the dangerous nature of power to be a man who simply fixed broken engines in the dirt. The weeks leading up to the engagement party were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My family did not yell. They did not throw things. Instead, they employed a suffocating brand of social gaslighting, delivering a series of tiny, precise cuts designed to bleed out my confidence before I even set foot inside the venue. It started exactly 14 days before the event. My mother, Celeste, sent me an email with the subject line reading "Wardrobe Suggestions." Attached was a highly curated digital mood board filled with pastel silk gowns and tailored designer suits. In the body of the email, she wrote in her sickly sweet tone that while she knew I preferred dressing for comfort, the photographer had a very specific, luminous aesthetic in mind for the evening. She strongly suggested I reconsider the classic navy blue dress I had already shown her, implying it was far too drab and simply would not fit the overall visual harmony of the family portraits. It was a polite, devastating way of telling me my presence was an eyesore they needed to heavily edit. 2 days later, the humiliation extended to Mason. We were sitting in his kitchen when his phone lit up with a direct message from my father. Mason did not try to hide it from me. Graham had written a brief, deeply condescending note. He told Mason to make sure he arrived precisely on time and to dress as neatly as possible. Then came the true poison pill. Graham explicitly instructed him to avoid discussing politics, business, or anything heavy with the VIP guests. My father was treating a grown man like a volatile teenager who needed strict behavioral boundaries before being allowed downstairs for dinner. The sheer scale of their manipulation became undeniable when an old college friend of mine, who now worked as a freelance floral arranger for elite events, accidentally forwarded me the preliminary vendor packet. Tucked inside the massive digital folder was the master seating chart. I scrolled through the document, my stomach twisting into a tight knot. The distant Stewart cousins, people my parents had not spoken to in over 5 years, were seated at table 4, mere feet away from the grand stage. Mason and I were assigned to table 42. It was not just the furthest table in the room, it was drawn directly adjacent to the swinging service doors of the catering kitchen, a physical manifestation of our absolute irrelevance, but the vendor packet revealed an even deeper betrayal. I opened the master script intended for the hired master of ceremonies. Highlighted in bright yellow was a specific directive from my mother regarding the opening toasts. The note explicitly instructed the host to welcome the bride-to-be, Brielle, and to introduce her simply as the proud daughter of the Stewart family. There was no mention of a younger sibling. There was no secondary introduction. I was being entirely erased from the official narrative of my own family. The final blow came during a brief phone call with that same floral arranger. She was chattering nervously about the immense pressure my father was putting on the event staff. She casually let slip that my father had distributed a strict crisis management checklist to the security team and the primary event coordinators. Under a section labeled Potential Disruptions, My name was listed in bold ink. Graham Stewart had officially designated his own daughter as a wild card, a volatile public relations risk that needed to be closely monitored and contained. For 3 agonizing days, I seriously considered refusing to attend. I wanted to stay home, turn off my phone, and completely sever the bleeding ties to my family. But my training and emergency response kicked in. I knew how to anticipate secondary disasters. If I boycotted the party, I would hand them the exact narrative they desperately wanted. They would stand in front of their wealthy peers, shake their heads with feigned parental sorrow, and spin a tragic tale about their difficult, emotionally unstable daughter who always made everything about herself. I would become the invisible villain, and they would harvest endless sympathy from my absence. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall. When Mason walked into the room, he saw the cold anger radiating from my posture. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me everything would magically work out. He sat down next to me, his presence solid and grounding. He looked me directly in the eyes and asked a question that stripped away all my defensive anger. He asked me if I wanted to beat them, or if I wanted to see them clearly. I thought about the years of being pushed into the shadows. I thought about the glossy brochures, the polite insults, and the constant, exhausting demand to be someone I was not. I realized that trying to win a rigged game was a complete waste of my life. I looked back at Mason and told him I just wanted to end the illusion. I wanted to stop pretending we were a family. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was another text message from Brielle. She sent a block of text telling me how much she loved me and how excited she was for the weekend. Yet, she had seen the seating chart. She had seen the Master of Ceremonies script. She knew exactly what our parents were doing, and she chose to remain entirely complicit. Her love was a hollow, spineless performance, a cowardly attempt to keep her own conscience clean while I was being systematically buried. In that quiet room, the last remaining thread of my desperate childhood hope finally snapped. I made my absolute, final decision. I was going to put on my dress. I was going to walk into that glass mansion. But I was no longer going to that party to beg for a scrap of validation or a sliver of genuine affection. I was going as a witness. I was going to quietly observe every fake smile, every calculated lie, and every hollow gesture. I was going to remember exactly who they were, so I would never, ever make the mistake of loving them again. We stepped into the glass mansion at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. The atmosphere inside was less of a celebration and more of a high-stakes corporate trading floor wrapped in silk and organza. Waiters glided through the room carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. Everywhere I looked, I saw the subtle, mechanical exchange of heavy cardstock business cards sliding into the breast pockets of custom tuxedos. The smiles on the faces of the guests were not expressions of joy. They were calculated measurements of mutual benefit, calculating exactly how much leverage or profit could be extracted from the person standing across from them. Mason and I arrived right on time, but my parents greeted us with the warmth of a sudden winter frost. My mother, Celeste, offered a tight, brief smile that barely moved her cheeks, muttered a quick greeting, and immediately turned her back to us to embrace an executive from the Hollowell side. My father gave me a singular, curt nod before launching into an animated, boisterous conversation with a local property developer. They were radiating absolute charm to every single person in the room who carried a significant net worth. But to their own flesh and blood, they offered nothing but an irritated dismissal. The hostess led us to our assigned seats. It was exactly as I had anticipated. We were placed at a cramped circular table shoved aggressively against the rear exit, directly in the chaotic flight path of the catering staff. Every time the heavy wooden doors swung open, a gust of hot, chaotic kitchen air hit the back of my neck. Even the floral arrangement on our table was noticeably smaller and less vibrant than the towering displays near the front of the room. A few of the minor guests seated near us cast quick, assessing glances at Mason. They took in his simple suit, the lack of an expensive watch on his wrist, and the permanent, rough calluses on his hands. You could practically see the exact moment their eyes glazed over as they silently categorized him as manual labor, instantly dismissing him as entirely irrelevant to their evening. Half an hour into the dinner service, the hired master of ceremonies took his position on the grand stage. His voice boomed through the pristine audio system, reading directly from the heavily vetted script my mother had prepared. He spent 5 solid minutes delivering soaring praises for Brielle and Grant. He spoke eloquently about the brilliant union of 2 powerful legacies, explicitly highlighting the Hollowell Hospitality Group and Stewart Stratagem. He meticulously listed the impressive academic and professional accomplishments of the bride. True to the hidden notes I had seen, my name was completely omitted from the entire welcoming address. I did not exist, then. My father walked up to the microphone to deliver his toast. He raised his glass, the stage lights catching the sparkling liquid inside. He spoke about Brielle with a booming theatrical pride, calling her the child who truly understands the absolute value of relentless ambition. The crowd murmured in polite agreement, but then, right on cue, Graham paused. The meticulously practiced warmth drained from his face, replaced by a sharp, mocking smirk. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on our dark corner by the kitchen doors. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with loud, public condescension. He asked me, in front of over 60 wealthy strangers, if I was actually still serious about my current living situation. He loudly wondered if I was still committed to playing house with the generator repairman from the suburbs. A collective, uncomfortable breath hitched in the grand ballroom. A few people let out awkward, muffled laughs, unsure if they were supposed to find the humiliation amusing or tragic. I kept my spine entirely straight and my mouth firmly shut. I refused to give my father the explosive reaction he was so desperately trying to provoke. Beside me, Mason did not show a single ounce of anger. He simply looked at my father with a quiet, impenetrable calmness. Then, moving with absolute dignity, Mason slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a silent, polite gesture signaling that he was preparing to excuse himself from the table so he would not cause a scene on my behalf. Standing up was the catalyst. By rising to his full height, Mason stepped out of the shadows and directly into the ambient light of a nearby chandelier. At the primary VIP table at the very center of the room, Russell Hollowell stopped breathing. The billionaire hotel mogul had been casually swirling his drink. But the moment Mason stood up, Russell froze completely. He pushed himself away from his table, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He took 2 stumbling steps away from the safety of his influential peers, completely ignoring the shocked stares of his family. Russell stared at Mason with wide, panicked eyes. His voice was incredibly tense, completely devoid of his usual commanding authority. It cracked loudly through the heavy silence of the ballroom. Mason Vale. Are you Mason Vale of Vale Infrastructure Resilience? The entire room went instantly, terrifyingly quiet. The soft jazz music from the corner abruptly stopped. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the marble floor. Up on the stage, Graham let out a loud, forced chuckle. He gripped the microphone, trying to seamlessly smooth over the interruption, loudly assuring the crowd that Russell must be making an incredibly strange joke. But Russell Hollowell was not laughing. He did not even look at my father. He kept his terrified gaze locked onto Mason. The polite, arrogant social mask of the billionaire had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated professional terror. The heavy silence stretched until it felt like the massive glass walls of the mansion might shatter from the sheer pressure. Russell Hollowell took another halting step toward our distant table, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. He did not look back at my father standing frozen on the stage. Instead, Russell addressed the entire room, his voice a raw mixture of professional awe and sheer, unadulterated panic. He told the wealthy crowd that the quiet man sitting by the kitchen doors was not just someone who tinkered with broken engines in a dusty yard. He announced with absolute clarity that Mason Vale was the founder and majority-controlling shareholder of Vale Infrastructure Resilience. Russell explained, his words rushing out in a desperate flood, that Vale was the premier contractor for emergency power systems and critical grid recovery across the entire eastern seaboard. He detailed how the company handled the life support infrastructure for international airports, major municipal hospital networks, and most importantly to the people in that room, luxury commercial real estate conglomerates. The whispers started instantly. They rippled through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos like a sudden, violent gust of wind catching a dry forest. The very same elite guests who had just snickered at my father mocking Mason were now staring at the two of us with a sudden, ravenous respect. But Russell did not stop there. The crushing desperation of his current financial reality bled entirely into his public speech. He confessed right there, in front of over 60 high-net-worth individuals, that the Hollowell Hospitality Group was currently teetering on the edge of a massive crisis. He admitted that his entire hotel empire was completely dependent on a massive, multi-million-dollar energy safety upgrade package. They desperately needed this specific overhaul to secure their commercial reinsurance policies and to complete a vital, life-saving refinancing deal by the end of the current fiscal year. And the only firm with the operational capacity to execute that massive overhaul in time was Vale Infrastructure Resilience. Mason was not just a random guest. He was the absolute key to saving the entire Hollowell legacy from total bankruptcy. The air in the grand ballroom grew incredibly thick and suffocating. The wealthy elite suddenly realized exactly what they had just witnessed over their crystal glasses of champagne. Graham Stewart, the supposed master of public relations, the man who built his entire fortune on protecting the image of the powerful, had just spent the last 10 minutes publicly and viciously humiliating the single most important man in the room. My father had openly insulted the absolute linchpin of a sensitive corporate rescue effort. I turned my head and looked at Mason. I fully expected him to finally unleash his anger, to revel in the sudden, dramatic shift of power and rub his immense, hidden wealth in the faces of my family. But he did not change his posture at all. He buttoned his dark suit jacket with the exact same calm, steady dignity he possessed when he was covered in dark engine grease at the utility yard. He looked at the trembling billionaire standing before him, then slowly turned his gaze toward the brightly lit stage where my father stood completely paralyzed. Mason spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried effortlessly across the silent, sprawling ballroom. He stated very plainly that he had never intended to hide his profession or the true scale of his company from anyone. He simply explained that since the very first day he met my family, not a single person bearing the Stewart name had ever bothered to ask him a single question past his initial job description. They heard the word repairman, instantly assigned him a permanent lower-class status in their minds, and immediately stopped listening. He told the room he never felt the need to correct people who were so committed to their own blind arrogance. Sitting there, listening to the frantic murmurs of the stunned crowd, a profound, heavy sadness washed over me. The sharpest pain of the night was not the sudden revelation of the corporate status of my boyfriend. I already knew he was an extraordinary, brilliant man. The true, devastating heartbreak was watching the reaction of my parents. My father was clutching the microphone stand so hard, his knuckles were entirely white, his face drained of all color. My mother was gripping the edge of a decorated table, her eyes wide with absolute horror. I realized in that exact moment that they were not horrified because they finally understood they had been incredibly cruel to a decent human being. They were only panicking because they realized they had been cruel to someone who held genuine, immense power over their own financial future. Their sudden visible remorse was entirely transactional. Their morality was completely tied to a bank account. The ripple effect at the primary VIP table was catastrophic to watch. Grant stood completely paralyzed between his father and the Stewart family, his usual polite demeanor completely crumbling under the immense weight of the massive corporate disaster unfolding in real time. Brielle looked absolutely terrified. All the healthy color had drained from her perfectly contoured face. She finally understood that her flawless engagement party, the glittering event meticulously designed to elevate her social standing and secure a massive public relations contract, was rapidly turning into the most spectacular social suicide in the history of our wealthy community. Desperate to salvage the flaming wreckage of the evening, my mother, Celeste, frantically signaled the hired jazz quartet in the corner. She plastered a wildly unnatural, strained smile across her face and loudly, almost hysterically, suggested that the band resume playing so everyone could get back to enjoying the wonderful evening. The confused musicians nervously raised their brass instruments, playing a few disjointed notes, but the cheerful music fell completely flat against the suffocating tension in the room. The elegant atmosphere was completely and irreparably shattered. No amount of soft music or vintage champagne could fix the massive fracture that had just torn through the room. Russell Hollowell completely ignored the desperate attempt of my mother to change the subject. He finally turned his back on Mason and faced the stage. The look he gave my father was colder than solid ice. He spoke slowly, making sure every single person in the room heard his exact words clearly. He reminded Graham that they had scheduled multiple closed-door meetings for the following week to discuss a transparent, strategic communications campaign regarding the mandatory safety upgrades of the hotels. Then, Russell delivered the final, devastating blow. He stated that considering the spectacular lack of judgment and situational awareness that had just transpired, perhaps they needed to severely review who was actually capable of controlling a narrative. My father looked as if the heavy glass ceiling had just collapsed directly onto his shoulders. The lucrative national contract he had built this entire night around, the deal he had sacrificed my dignity to secure, had just evaporated into thin air before his very eyes. I did not feel the need to shout, to cry, or to demand an apology from the stage. I simply stood up from my uncomfortable chair. I did not run away in tears, and I did not storm out in a fit of dramatic rage. I picked up my small evening bag and placed my hand gently on the solid arm of Mason. Together, we walked away from the cramped table situated by the kitchen doors. We walked straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, passing the silent, staring crowd of dozens of elite guests. We did not rush our steps. We walked with the calm, quiet grace of two people who no longer needed to explain their worth to anyone. Stepping out into the cool night air while the undeniable truth we left behind spoke entirely for itself. The morning after the disastrous engagement dinner, my phone began ringing at precisely 7 o'clock. The caller identification flashed with the name of my father. I answered, foolishly expecting at least a fraction of parental remorse. Instead, Graham bypassed any form of a greeting or an apology. His voice was tight, clipped, and completely transactional. He demanded that I immediately drive over to the repair yard and convince Mason to maintain his operational partnership with the hotel group. Graham actually had the sheer audacity to frame this as my filial duty, aggressively stating that the entire financial future of our family rested squarely on my ability to smooth things over. Less than an hour later, my mother called. Celeste requested a private morning coffee, her tone dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness. Within 2 minutes of the conversation, she masterfully twisted the narrative, accusing me of intentionally sabotaging the milestone event of my sister. She claimed I deliberately weaponized the hidden identity of my boyfriend just to inject malicious drama into a night that had nothing to do with me. For the very first time in my 31 years of life, I did not absorb their manufactured guilt. I did not apologize to keep the peace. I gripped my phone, took a steady breath, and delivered a clear, unbreakable boundary. I told my parents that I was officially resigning from my lifelong position as the emotional buffer for their corporate greed. I refused to act as a convenient bridge to a man they had viciously mocked less than 12 hours prior. I ended the call and switched my phone to silent mode. By Tuesday afternoon, the meticulously curated social armor of Stuart's stratagem began to crack in spectacular fashion. A guest from the party, someone seated near the middle of the room, had been recording a video of the toast on their mobile device. That short, damning clip leaked into the private group messages of the local corporate elite. Within 48 hours, The footage of Graham sneering at my career and blatantly insulting an essential worker was circulating through the most influential country clubs and boardrooms in the state. The entire brand of my father relied heavily on promoting decent, wholesome family values and profound social empathy. Watching the polished crisis manager publicly bully his own flesh and blood completely shattered that illusion. Several minor clients quietly pulled their pending retainers by Wednesday morning. The collateral damage eventually struck Brielle. She called me late Thursday evening, her voice breaking into hysterical, jagged sobs. The pristine wedding she had been plotting for over 2 years was suddenly crumbling. Grant had just left her luxury apartment after a devastating argument. He had informed her that he wanted to indefinitely postpone all wedding planning. Grant was a passive man, but watching his future father-in-law publicly humiliate people based on their perceived income bracket had crossed a fundamental moral line. Grant told Brielle he simply could not marry into a family that only knew how to respect human beings when they thought a professional camera was recording them. My sister begged me to fix it, still desperately clinging to the illusion that I was responsible for the mess our parents had created. But the ultimate betrayal, the final piece of evidence that eradicated any lingering shred of familial loyalty, arrived anonymously in my electronic inbox on Thursday night. The sender was a former junior graphic designer who had recently quit the firm of my father due to a toxic work environment. The email contained a heavily encrypted file. I opened it and found the final, high-resolution version of the pitch deck Stewart's Stratagem had formally submitted to the Hollowell Executive Board 2 weeks ago. I scrolled down to page 22 and my blood instantly turned to ice. Staring back at me was a massive, full-color photograph of myself. It was an image taken during a grueling 90-hour recovery effort following a massive Category 4 hurricane 3 years ago. I was standing in knee-deep floodwater, wearing my heavy neon reflective gear, covered in mud, and looking utterly exhausted while directing a convoy of utility trucks. My parents had secretly harvested this image from my private social media page, but the true horror was the text printed directly beneath it. The caption did not identify me as an emergency grid coordinator. It falsely labeled me as a dedicated community outreach advisor for Stewart's Stratagem. They had blatantly stolen the grueling, dangerous labor that they actively despised and repackaged it into a hollow marketing tool to prove their firm understood the struggles of essential, blue-collar workers. The whistleblower had attached one more file. It was an internal company memo forwarded directly from the private email address of Graham. The text was brief and utterly devoid of any human decency. My father had explicitly instructed his design team to keep his youngest daughter strictly in the background during all high-profile social events, but he ordered them to utilize her disaster relief imagery in the Hollowell presentation to artificially increase the authenticity of their corporate empathy campaign. They viewed me as a humiliating secret in public, but a highly profitable mascot on paper. I sat on my living room sofa, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, shaking with a cold, focused fury. Mason walked into the room, took one look at my face, and read the documents over my shoulder. He did not tell me to burn their company to the ground, nor did he urge me to forgive them. He outlined his own professional boundaries very clearly. He stated that his legal team was already preparing to formally withdraw FIL infrastructure from all negotiations if Stewart's Stratagem remained attached to the project. He was going to ruthlessly protect his own enterprise. However, he placed a warm hand on my shoulder and told me that the family aspect was entirely my battle to command. He urged me to make whatever decision would allow me to sleep peacefully 50 years from now. The next morning, an urgent calendar invitation appeared on my phone. The Hollowell and Stewart families had arranged an emergency reconciliation meeting in a private boardroom at the flagship hotel downtown. My mother's note pleaded for my attendance and called it a misunderstanding. I accepted. When Mason and I arrived Tuesday morning at the Hollowell property in Arbor Gate, everyone was already seated, my parents on one side, Russell and Grant on the other, and Brielle between them, exhausted and silent. We took the last 2 chairs at the far end of the table. My father Graham wasted absolutely no time. He immediately launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue. It was a masterclass in corporate damage control, completely devoid of any genuine human emotion. He spoke smoothly for nearly 10 minutes, weaving a pathetic narrative about unfortunate familial misunderstandings, the immense stress of wedding planning, and the paramount importance of moving forward with a united front. He slid a crisp, printed document across the table toward me. It was a pre-written press release. He warmly suggested that if I simply accepted his apology today, they could immediately publish the statement to the local business journals, officially declaring that the Stewart family had overcome a minor internal hurdle and emerged stronger than ever. I did not interrupt him. I sat quietly, letting the sheer toxic audacity of his plan fill the silent room. When he finally finished speaking, he looked at me with an expectant, demanding smile, waiting for me to play my assigned role and fold. Instead of picking up his fake press release, I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a manila folder. I opened it and placed the high-resolution color printout of their corporate pitch deck face up on the polished wood. Next to it, I placed a printed copy of the damning internal email sent by my father. I did not slide them to my parents. I slid them directly across the table to Russell Hollowell, Grant, and my sister, Brielle. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of the hysterical anger my parents always anticipated. I told the room that I was not there to accept a highly calculated public relations strategy disguised as an apology. I pointed directly at the photograph of myself standing in floodwater wearing a neon utility jacket. I explained to Russell that while my parents were busy publicly mocking my career and hiding me by the kitchen doors to protect their elite image, they were simultaneously stealing my professional struggles to sell him a multi-million-dollar crisis management contract. They had falsely labeled me a corporate outreach advisor because they were too cowardly to admit they had a blue-collar daughter, yet they were greedy enough to weaponize my grueling labor to prove they understood the essential workforce. Russell Hollowell picked up the email. His eyes scanned the exact words my father had written, explicitly ordering his design team to keep me hidden in the background while exploiting my disaster relief imagery for authenticity. The face of the billionaire hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He finally realized that Graham Stewart was not a masterful crisis manager. He was a ruthless, unethical fraud who would happily cannibalize his own flesh and blood for a lucrative retainer. Before my father could even open his mouth to spin a desperate defense, Mason leaned forward. He did not raise his voice, nor did he speak out of blind emotional anger. He delivered a cold, strictly professional execution. Mason stated clearly that FIL Infrastructure Resilience was officially withdrawing from all current and future contract negotiations involving the Hollowell Hotel upgrades effective immediately unless Stewart's stratagem was completely removed from the equation. He looked directly at Russell and explained that his company dealt with life-or-death municipal infrastructure, and he categorically refused to partner with any public relations firm that displayed such a spectacularly dangerous lack of ethical integrity. That was the exact moment my father completely lost his mind. The charming polished mask of the elite crisis manager shattered into a million jagged pieces. Graham slammed his hands down on the mahogany table, his face flushing a deep, furious red. He pointed a shaking finger at me and began to shout. He abandoned all pretense of a corporate meeting and fully exposed his controlling nature. He viciously accused me of being a selfish, ungrateful failure who was actively destroying the incredibly bright future of my sister. He screamed that I was ruining the greatest financial opportunity this family had ever seen just to nurse a petty, pathetic grudge. He was still shouting when Brielle suddenly pushed her heavy chair back and stood up. My older sister, the golden child who had spent 29 years quietly complying with every single demand our parents ever made, looked directly at our father and told him to stop. Her voice shook, but it was incredibly loud. She told him that I was not the one destroying anything. She pointed directly at Graham and Celeste, telling them straight to their faces that they were the ones who had ruined her engagement. Then Brielle did something that completely shifted the gravity in the room. She reached down, took the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring off her left hand, and placed it gently on the table right in front of Grant. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and explained that she was not breaking up with him, but she refused to walk down the aisle and enter a marriage that had been completely hijacked and twisted into a hostile corporate takeover by their two families. She told Grant they needed to stop the wedding planning entirely until they could figure out who they actually were without the suffocating influence of their parents. Grant looked down at the glittering ring. He looked at his incredibly intimidating billionaire father who was watching him intensely. Then, for the very first time since I had met him, Grant Hollowell defied his bloodline. He reached across the table, picked up the ring, and gently took the hand of my sister. He squeezed her fingers tightly and firmly stated that he completely agreed with her. The profound silence that followed was the sound of an entire family empire collapsing under the weight of its own lies. I stood up from the table. I looked down at my parents who were staring at the scene in absolute ruined shock. I delivered my final non-negotiable terms. I told them that if they ever wanted to have any form of a relationship with me in the future, it would not happen in front of a camera. There would be no strategic press releases, no social media posts, and absolutely no utilizing my life or my career for their corporate portfolio. If they ever found the capacity to offer a genuine private apology, I might listen. Until then, they were to completely respect my boundaries and leave me alone. I did not wait for their response. I picked up my bag, turned my back on the luxurious boardroom, and walked out the door with Mason right beside me. Walking down that quiet carpeted hallway, I realized I did not need a single person in that room to validate my worth anymore. I had kept my dignity intact. I had forced them to violently confront the ugly truth they had spent decades trying to bury. And for the very first time in my entire life, instead of waiting in the shadows for my family to finally choose me, I had confidently chosen myself. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and share it so more people can find the channel.